As a RED owner, I have been very curious to try out the Canon RAW ever since Canon came out with it. I want to know, what is the workflow like? Is it similar to RED RAW? How flexible is the image? What settings do they give you? What exactly does the image look like? And most importantly, how does it play back on the computer? So a friend of mine bought the Canon R5, and I thought it would be a good idea to compare the 8K RAW to the RED's 5K RAW. All right, I am here with my friend Connor. He is the one with the Canon R5. And he is so generously letting me borrow his skills so we can test out the RAW. With that?
Yeah.
Now this isn't a scientific video, I just wanted to get my hands on that 8K RAW and see what it's like for the first time. Now yesterday we went out and shot a bunch of stuff together. Ran into one of Connor's friends slacklining, so we're gonna shoot some video of him instead of me. But I do want to say I went very light on the shooting. I did not want 400 gigs of video, so we don't have a ton of footage, but we do definitely have a solid sequence and a couple good test shots. For every RED shot, I tried to get an R5 shot so that we could compare the two. Let's take a look at both of these. You guys can make your guesses, and after I'll let you know which camera is which. Alright, that is the footage. I am curious to know if you guys guessed which camera was which, and if you got it right. So let me tell you, camera A was the RED, camera B was the R5. Did you get it right? I think there may have been a little something that gave it away, and it starts with an I and ends with IBIS. A couple things to note. One, we shot this handheld. I kind of forgot how shaky mirrorless cameras can be, and there seemed to be a pretty significant warp on that R5 footage. Another thing to note is I didn't want to use any ND filters. I wanted to prevent any color casting and get as clean of an image through my camera as possible. So a lot of this was shot at like above f10, but I don't think that really makes much of a difference. Now moving on to some first impressions, I gotta say I was very impressed with the R5 dynamic range and the image overall. It is definitely a phenomenal camera. I should also say it did not overheat at all during this shoot. I mean, it wasn't a very long shoot, but it didn't overheat. Straight out of the gate, without touching anything on the R5 footage, it just looked good. It kind of had that like classic high contrast Canon look, but needless to say, I was very impressed. Now when it comes to actually physically shooting between the two cameras, well, there's a big difference. The RED is like this massive 20-pound camera, and the R5 is this tiny mirrorless camera. I think the fact that you can get that quality out of the R5 is insane. Honestly, there aren't too many advantages to a bigger camera, other than like more stable handheld. You look cool. That's about it. I mean, with a small mirrorless camera, it's great. You can throw it on any gimbal, you can throw it over your shoulder, hike up any mountain. There's a lot of benefits to having a small camera. And this camera packs a huge cinematic punch. Actually, my friend Connor, who I shot this video with, does a lot of rock climbing with his camera, so it is perfect for what he does. He's also a photographer. I'm not sure which one he would say is his main, but he does both. That being said, the R5 is a photography camera first, with some very impressive video features. So a lot of the features that the camera comes with does have photography in mind, where obviously the RED is a cinema camera. So I think the big question here is, how does the image compare? Now again, I would classify the R5 image as the classic Canon look, high contrast, beautiful colors. This is very typical what you would expect from Canon. Now when we talk about RED's image, it's a little bit more tricky. There's a lot more variables that go into it. For example, when I am shooting in a legacy image pipeline. And then when I start editing, I switch it to IPP2, which is RED's image pipeline 2. It's like the updated image processing pipeline, where I then have to pick my highlight roll-off and my tone map. So at this point, I've already made 3 decisions that are going to change my image. But I would say overall, RED is known for having high contrast with a yellow tint. Now when it comes to dynamic range, again, I'd have to give it to the RED here. It really shines in retaining that information in the highlights. Although the R5 is phenomenal with its dynamic range, we can really see here in this example where the highlights are clipped on the R5, but then on the RED, it's retaining information in both the highlights and the shadows. I also did a zoom test where, no surprise, the R5 8K absolutely crushed it. Now when it comes to flexibility in the shadows, we did an underexposed test, which you guys saw in the B-roll. We can see with the RED, when we bring the exposure up, it still is a very clean image. But when we pull the exposure up on the R5, we can see a bunch of noise in the shadows here on his pants. Which brings us to the next point here, the editing process. Now this part is where things really get interesting. The first thing I did when I got home is I imported the footage and dragged it right into a Premiere timeline. By default, it was an 8K timeline and Premiere just crashed. I quickly realized that I probably had to do a 4K timeline in order to use this footage. And yes, that was the case. Now I would say I have a pretty decent editing machine. It's a 12-core 3900X processor with a 2070 Super. It gets the job done. I was able to usably scrub and play back the footage at quarter quality in a 4K timeline, but at times it was very choppy and I wouldn't imagine shooting an entire video in 8K RAW. Especially once you start adding on some effects, I imagine it would be a bit of a nightmare. Now when it comes to R3D files, they typically play like butter, no issues until you start adding effects. Like my 2016 iMac can play RED files, no problem. Now if they were 8K RED files, I'm sure that would probably make a difference. But when it comes to 5K files, I'm good to go. So the big question I had here is what is the difference between the RAW? When you edit RED RAW footage, you have all these metadata settings. You can change your ISO, your picture profile, your tone map, your highlight roll off. Like there's all these settings for you to change. Honestly, more settings than I will probably ever use. So it looks like Canon broke its RAW down to 5 settings, which is alright, but I honestly expected a little bit more. This was my first time using their RAW. Now my perspective is a little different. I work in RAW all the time, so then going to the R5 RAW, you can definitely tell that it was made for the regular user. The big difference is being able to change your ISO. With the RED footage, you can choose whatever ISO you want. With the R5 footage, you have an exposure slider. That makes a significant difference. It seems more like the exposure slider is more of like an afterthought setting, where changing your ISO is actually changing the data of your file. Now, like I said, this isn't a scientific review between the two codecs, but on surface level, there is a big difference between the RAWs. Now, when it comes to file size and exporting, no surprises here. The 8K footage seems to be about 2 times as big, and that's even with me shooting as thick as possible on my RED. 2 C's. And I did an export test where I put 2 clips together, one from RED, one from R5, and there was a significant slowdown in the export when it got to around the 50% mark. So if you're shooting 8K RAW videos, expect your exports to be pretty slow. I would imagine that there'd be a lot of encoding that's going on there. Alright, that is it. I had a lot of fun shooting this video. I enjoyed playing with the footage. Actually, I'd be very curious to compare my camera to a lot of other cameras, like maybe the C300 Mark III, C70, Zcam, all these other cameras that I'm very interested in. I want to know, like, what is the difference between that RAW and my RAW. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.